say? Okay, here I am. Whoa, I'm loud. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to Science on Tap, another year. Hope everybody had a great summer. And now we are definitely into fall weather. I think there's some real weather coming in the next couple of days. My name is Susan Knight. I work at University of Wisconsin Trout Lake Station. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea. The idea conceived in 1905 that the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. And our partners in Science on Tap include Minocqua Public Library, the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, Kemp Natural Resources Station, Trout Lake Station, WXPR, and our host, Oak Fire. And Science on Tap is supported through a grant from the Brittingham Fund to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We thank them. And I don't usually do this, but I want to take a minute to let you know all the people that are involved in Science on Tap. You see me all the time, and you see Carol. There's Carol. But there are many other people that are involved. First of all, we've got Peg O'Connell, who is right there in the back. She's the head of the library, Minocqua Public Library. Very important for us. We've got Mary Taylor. Many of you know her from formerly with the Minocqua Public Library and now representing the Wisconsin Alumni Association. Let's see, we have Carol Warden, who is here, and she's been doing the microphone. We've got Amber Murnack, and she is our station coordinator and does outreach and education for us up at Trout Lake Station. We have Gretchen Garish and Noah Wadig that are waving to you from up in the control booth. And Noah does all of the tech support along with Paul Schramm. Paul is still on vacation, but he is usually up there. And we've got Scott Bovey, who is not right here tonight, but is very important for us. He has an event going on at Kemp Natural Resources Station, so he couldn't be here today. We have Erin Gottsacker here. Erin, wave your hand, from WXPR. She and Katie Thorson are wonderful partners that we are now partnering with, and they are sponsoring Science on Tap and do a lot of great advertising and do our interviews, and it's been great. And then we've got Oak Fire, and we have Paul and Rudy from Oak Fire, and we have two great bartenders here that are going to take care of whatever you need tonight. So thanks for everybody. Thanks to our committee who helps us figure out who we're going to invite and involve. And please remember, if you want to be on our email list, to sign up in the back of the room. We have a sheet if you would just sign up clearly. And also, if you have any ideas of speakers, you can just jot them right down on that same piece of paper. And don't forget that you can watch live. Hopefully we will be live now for the entire year and we won't have another pandemic. But you can always watch on YouTube as well. So you could go to YouTube, go to our Science on Tap Minocqua website and watch live, and you can go to it right there. So that's pretty easy to do. And we also archive our videos so that you can see, if you miss one, you can watch it later. And our next speaker will be Nathaniel Chin from UW-Madison, speaking on Alzheimer's disease on November 2nd. So that should be very interesting. We've been interested in getting somebody, but we kept forgetting to ask to find somebody to do it. Anyway, we've got Nathaniel Chin, pretty bad joke, I know. Okay, but tonight we have Dr. Scott Craven. He's a professor emeritus from UW-Madison. He's been retired 11 years, and from the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. Scott Craven is a wildlife ecologist and wildlife specialist, and from a young age, Scott's hero was Aldo Leopold, and many of you as well, I'm sure, the father of wildlife ecology. And Leopold is the reason Scott decided to become a wildlife specialist. Scott was originally from New Hampshire, and he attended the University of New Hampshire and earned a degree in zoology. He then moved to Madison in 1972 to attend graduate school at the UW-Madison's Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. Probably wasn't called that back then, was it? Wildlife ecology, yeah. And Scott joined the department as a faculty member in 1979. In addition to teaching and advising students and conducting research and serving as department chair, he was also a wildlife ecology specialist for UW Extension. And Scott retired from teaching, as I said, about 11 years ago, but he continues to work with specific extension programs. And maybe many of you hear him on the Larry Mueller Show once a month. He was on this morning, in fact, on Wisconsin Public Radio. And tonight, Scott will discuss science as the basis of wildlife management and conservation. Okay, before we get to his comments, we have a trivia question for you. Okay, so some of you oldsters may remember Mutual of Omaha. Yes, right, I sure do. It was my favorite show when I was a kid. Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom with Marlin Perkins. As an eminent wildlife biologist, it isn't surprising that Scott Craven was featured in an episode of that show. Scott and his colleagues were banding geese under the watchful eye of the Wild Kingdom TV crew. And surprise, surprise, but Marlin does not actually hang around much for the filming. So he wasn't around for much of the taping, but the idea was that Scott and the Wild Kingdom film crew would get the footage, and then sometime in the future, Marlin Perkins would return to be filmed with Scott for a few special moments with the real scientist, which is Scott Craven. The crew was very attentive to detail and wanted to make it look like Perkins had been there for the whole time. So when they returned, how much later? About a year later? A year later, they made everything look the same as the original taping. There was just one small problem. What was it? A, Scott had recently broken his wrist and was clearly now wearing an arm-length cast. B, Scott had shaved off his mustache and beard since the first shoot. Or C, they couldn't find any geese to get in the TV shot with Marlin Perkins. All right, so what do you think? Wrist, beard, or geese? Geese. You're wrong. Shaved off his beard. Okay, here's Scott Craven.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Fine. I've been doing this for a long time. As was mentioned, I started on the faculty in 1979 as an extension specialist, among other things. So my job for many years was to conduct this, or to, in practice, carry this Wisconsin idea around the state, bringing information from the university, in my case on wildlife, to anybody and everybody off campus. And it was a very rewarding part of the job, and I still enjoy it to this day, which is why I'm here, because I have been retired for 11 years. It gets harder and harder to stay in the loop in terms of scientific advancements and management issues and other things, but I have to try and do that because, again, of the aforementioned radio program. Well, I guess I shouldn't disclose anything about Larry's retirement, but when when Larry goes, and he's told me before and then never followed through, but nevertheless, I think he's going to this time. And when Larry goes, I go. So that will be the end of a nearly 40-year run on the radio with Larry. And he's a really good guy. And as you can imagine, doing that program every day for all those years, he can talk articulately about any topic you could come up with, including he's become a pretty good wildlife specialist after listening to me for 40 years. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. But I'm familiar with this kind of thing. Sometimes it's for huge crowds. Sometimes it's for smaller groups. Frankly, I'm happy we have kind of what I'd describe as a cozy group here, because I'd rather turn fairly quickly to questions so that you leave feeling that what you might have come to hear about is actually addressed because you asked the question. And the other issue, and I'll apologize in advance, I'm still struggling with the aftermath of a COVID case from a month or so ago upon return from Europe, when I think everybody on the boat with us came down with it. But nevertheless, I'm still dealing with a little shortness of breath and a cough, which apparently can last quite a while. So if I start gasping up here, there's no need to run up for the Heimlich maneuver. I have water and I have a supply of cough drops, and we'll make it work. Anyhow, my topic tonight is to talk a little bit about science and its role in wildlife conservation, and some of the issues involved with it, some of the problems or challenges, and what role science plays and what role you can play, because there is an important role that has developed over the past few years called citizen science, where people like you are essentially brought on board by the DNR or the Fish and Wildlife Service or other resource agencies to help collect information needed to better understand and manage various species, because they simply don't have the staff, the time, or the available effort to collect that information. So make sure I talk about that a little bit, because I think everybody could probably find an opportunity they'd find interesting. I always enjoy getting up here. I have a cabin over in Price, the northeastern county, a corner of Price County, just a little bit north of Pike Lake. I'm not going to hit that this time because I know it's cold and dark, and I'm going to head south right after the program and try and get back to Madison. It was a beautiful drive up. About from south of Wausau, the rest of the way, the color has really popped in the last few days, and it was just beautiful. And then I realized that most of the brilliant orange that I was seeing were actually somewhere between 10 and 15 million highway construction barrels. I think that they've got damn near the entire highway from DeForest to just south of town torn up in one way or another. And between the road work ahead orange signs and the orange barrels, it's very colorful. Anyway, but the foliage is nice. I hope the rain and the wind coming up and all don't ruin it too quickly. It's a very short season, and that's unfortunate because it's certainly my favorite time of the year up here. Anyway, my game plan is severalfold. First of all, I'm going to say a little bit about science in general, and that works pretty well, I think, since this is the opening talk of the session. Talk a little bit about a definition of science, or at least what I think it is. Then I'm going to talk about the role of science in wildlife conservation, primarily with science being a component of something called the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation. Can any of you honestly say that you have heard of the North American Model of Wildlife Conservation? Sort of. Well, I'll describe this a little bit because it's really quite important, but it's one of the best kept secrets in the profession. And we'll get to that a little bit later. And then I'm going to talk about some of the things science has done for us lately in terms of wildlife conservation and management, and some of the aforementioned issues and problems. For example, one of the biggest ones for me is political tinkering. Science has been cast aside in many cases recently in favor of politicians making decisions. We'll get to that. We'll get to the fact that in some cases science has outstripped our ability to regulate or understand its impact on resources. For example, the use of drones. I mean, who would have ever imagined some of this stuff was going to be available a few years ago? Drones, the cell phone you've probably all got in your pocket, and that cell phone is infinitely more powerful than the communicator that Captain Kirk used to carry on the Enterprise. And he could do amazing stuff with that. But you've got that at your fingertips. And there are uses for that in hunting, in other aspects of land management and so forth, that again, maybe stretch the window a little bit on fair chase and fair pursuit. The newest one I'm learning about is for any fisher persons in the group, one called Livescope 360, essentially a very fancy fish finder, 360-degree view underwater. I've got a couple of friends who have them. They have 19-inch monitors in the front of the boat and the back of the boat, so they can sit there and watch the monitor. If you've ever seen the images, I mean, you're going along and somebody, oh, there's a nice walleye right next to that stump. I mean, it's 40 feet away and it's 20 feet down, but there it is, plain as day. cast over there. Ah, I got him. And you can actually see the fish take the bait. And that, I think that those kinds of things, I kind of equate technology and science, and those kinds of technological adaptations have really changed the playing field for hunting and fishing and other outdoor uses. Anyway, we'll get back to that too, and I hope you have some questions on that. I understand that Livescope system was banned at a recent fishing tournament in Eagle River because it was considered unfair advantage. Whether it was to the competitors or the fish, I don't know, but it was unfair to somebody. So that's the way they left it. So we'll get to all of that in due time. And I welcome questions or comments. If I say something that you find confusing or perhaps, gee, I don't agree with that, hey, feel free to raise your hand and I don't mind getting diverted onto tangents. So what is science in general? The dictionary definition I came up with is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Seems straightforward enough. I prefer to actually substitute intellectual for basic and practical for applied. That's the common separation in science we talk about on campus. Someone doing basic science, attempting to move forward human knowledge about COVID or something like that, as opposed to someone who's doing a very applied scientific experiment to test different herbicides on corn or something like that. Applied versus basic. And then further, the two basic types of data collection, observation, and experiment. Okay? Observational science has been around for years. As soon as people started watching birds or monitoring phenology in the spring, when do the robins come back? When do the lilacs bloom? That's observational science. Experimental follows the scientific method. You come up with a theory to explain some event. You develop a hypothesis related to that. You conduct experiments, you collect data, you analyze the data, you come to a conclusion, you publicize your conclusion. That's how knowledge for the human race is advanced. If you don't publish your findings or in some way convey them to others, essentially nothing's been gained. So that's the way the system works. To the idea of observation and experimentation, I'd add one other category, experiential or experience. There are a number of people I know in the profession, including a very well-known and well-liked wildlife manager, DNR staff person here in Oneida County, Ron Eckstein, who retired a few years ago. Ron's a great guy, good personal friend, and he was extremely knowledgeable about what was going on in this county, whether it was eagles or deer or just about anything else, because he'd been here for a long time and he simply lived with these species and knew what was going on. That to me is just as valuable as the experimentation or the observation. And people, because of Ron's authoritative demeanor and personality, people trusted him and things got done. That's not always easy to do anymore. Okay, let's see, where does that take us? Let me move on a little quickly here before I lose my voice. The use of science to guide management has a very long history. And Leopold first recognized this and published a piece that speaks to it in 1930. And I just wanted to read that short piece to you because it's become part of this model. Where did Leopold's comment go? Well, I thought I had it identified here, but now I've got to find it. Oh, there we are. So in 1930, when Leopold was working on the American game policy, he called for restoration of wildlife and a corps of trained wildlife biologists that made decisions based on facts, professional experience, and an underlying set of principles for the emerging profession. This was the true beginning of science being actively used in management of North America's wildlife resources. Development of wildlife management and all related policies must be based on knowledge, and knowledge is advanced by experience and fact finding, i.e., research and science. Science based on research was required to convert the profession's newly minted principles into active actions on the landscape. So that was almost 100 years ago, and it's still true today. And it also became the basis of this model that I want to tell you a little bit about. When you hear about something titled a model for conservation, I think the impression most people get, including all of our students, is that this is a little handbook that every wildlife manager has on their shelf in their office. And when they need to know, well, let's see, how many does should we harvest this year? Or what should we attach to point values for ducks or whatever, that they just open up the model, oh, page 6, doe harvest, and they get an answer. It's not the case at all. It is not a working guide to anything. What it is a historical summary of the way wildlife conservation proceeded over time in North America, from the end of the days of market hunting in the late 1800s through the present time. And that's all it is. It's a summary of what happened, simply because our system here in North America is quite different than the systems used in most other parts of the world. And that's because there are 7 basic principles or tenets that are elucidated in here that have guided work for, again, over 100 years. And it was defined and described after the fact. It wasn't something that anybody was doing consciously. Well, the relevant one for tonight's purposes is tenet number 6, which simply stated, if I get my eyes on, tenet number 6. There are a couple of others. I think I'll read them all so you know what the basis of this is. Wildlife resources are a public trust. That's the backbone of the whole thing. In other words, the public owns the wildlife. You as a landowner, sure, you've got deer on your property, but from a technical standpoint, the deer are public property. Now, the sticky wicket in American policy is that as a private landowner, you control access. So in a sense, in a de facto way, you control how those deer are perhaps harvested or by whom or when or what have you. But the fact is the animals are in fact a public trust resource. Markets for game are eliminated. Remember, this came on board after market hunting was eliminated. No more buffalo hunting, no more mass slaughters of waterfowl on Chesapeake Bay. That was out. The allocation of wildlife is by law. In other words, governments, state, local, or what have you, set regulations to decide how that public trust resource is to be allocated amongst the public. 6 ducks apiece, 1 deer, whatever the case may be, allocated by law. Wildlife can be killed only for a legitimate purpose. Frivolous killing, killing and waste, the kind of market hunting that killed God knows how many bison just for their tongues, that was all gone. Wildlife is considered an international resource. So this reflected the understanding that birds were migratory and crossed international boundaries. And then number 6, the critical one for our purposes, science is the proper tool to discharge wildlife policy. In other words, whatever's going to be done should be based solidly on science. And lastly, the democracy of hunting is standard procedure. Everyone should have equal access to hunting opportunity. Now, it doesn't mean this is a hunting plan per se. It applies to all species, but they do single out hunting in that case. So all this really does is look back at how we got to where we are. And if that provides a little guidance for the future, great. But it separates us from the European system, where the landowner controlled everything and owned the game, and other systems around the world. Okay. In terms of what science has done for us lately, I don't think it's too difficult for anyone to think just about anything they may have encountered today, whether it's the technology in your automobile or the third COVID vaccine somebody jabbed in your arm yesterday, or how your cell phone works. Science really drives our lives. And most people take most of those things for granted and accept the fact that the reason we have these cell phones, the reason we have these vaccines, is because scientists have figured out how to do this and then made it available to the rest of us. Which is why I find it particularly troubling that when scientists tell us that, hey, climate change is a real thing and we are going to be screwed if we don't do something soon. And yet, how many deniers are out there that simply disregard that information and go on with their lives as if it didn't exist? That's a little baffling to me. We'll come up with some other examples in a bit. What about, you can help me out here, what about in the wildlife arena? Can you think of anything? Well, just come out with some ideas. What do you see being done in the wildlife arena with any species you want to pick? And what's the science behind the actions being taken? Anything. Oh, nice choice. That's going to come up later as one of the failures of science, but since you brought it up, there were two things I was hoping to avoid tonight. One was wolves, and the other one was chronic wasting disease. But since the scab's been picked off the wound, we'll talk about it for a minute. Chronic wasting disease has been around since February of 2002. So here we are, a little more than 20 years later. Have we really we've made a lot of progress in understanding it in terms of transmission, distribution, and so forth. But have we made any progress in controlling it? I don't think so. And that's a little surprising when now there are some reasons for that, because the cause of the disease or problems, prions, are very difficult to deal with conceptually and so forth. Whereas when humans were faced with a major calamity in the form of COVID, I mean, vaccines were forthcoming in a matter of months, or at least the work proceeded very quickly. No such thing has been accomplished with chronic wasting disease. But again, that's victimized in some circles by the same type of mindset that climate change has faced. Chronic wasting disease is a hoax. It's not that big a problem. We're going to eat the deer anyway. Well, that's fine. A lot of people have their own opinions on these kinds of things, but the short answer to your question is there's been a lot of scientific attention to different aspects of CWD, but in terms of being any closer to the two things we really need, either a cure or at least a rapid test so that hunters can test their deer just like that on site. Nope, this one's sick. I'm not going to have to drag it out of the woods, haul it home, cut it up, put it in the freezer, only to get a call from the warden 2 or 3 weeks later, say, oh, your deer was positive. Get rid of it. That's happened to me 7 times. And I'm less than happy about it. The disease was discovered 6 miles from the farm I've been hunting on for 50 years. And between my son and I, we've killed 9 positive animals. And it's a very depressing situation, to the point that I'm about ready to cash out on deer hunting, at least in that part of the state. The rapid test would help a lot, but so far nobody's home on that. And in terms of some type of treatment, the real obstacle there is, even if they find some treatment, how do you administer it to however many million deer are out there? We used to have an estimate, but thanks to the political meddling that I'll talk about in a few minutes, we no longer have an estimate of the herd, because Dr. Deer back in 2012 in his report said that these deer population estimates were confusing the public and messing up the system, and we should no longer be confusing the people with some estimate of how many deer were out there. Whatever. But the bottom line is, however many deer there are, trying to give them all a pill or a vaccination or whatever is not likely to happen. I don't know if that answered your, I guess you were just suggesting that CWD was involved. So never mind. You got me all worked up there on that particular problem. But other simpler things. What about the actually? Don't start. It was an interesting one that came up on the radio this morning when a caller mentioned the 1921 page that he had from the Vilas County Times, and it talked about a couple young Sainer residents who had that morning shot several hundred cranes to obtain the $1 bounty. This was in 1921. A buck times several hundred was a lot of money in those days. And it turned out that the person who handed over said, could these really be cranes? I mean, I didn't think we had that many cranes. Well, we didn't, and certainly not up here. They weren't cranes. In those days, great blue herons were sometimes called blue cranes. And they were heavily persecuted because people thought, oh, they're eating up all our fish. And therefore, they were bountied for a while by local government. And as close to 1,000 were killed from a couple rookeries in Vilas County that particular year. Who knows how many in other years. So we were able to solve that mystery, but that's just a thing of the past. But presumably science has entered in and determined that the food habits of blue herons are not that detrimental to fisheries and they're no longer persecuted. But just about anything you could think of, even bird food preferences at your feeding station. There have been dozens of studies of what birds prefer what seeds, and they guide what people buy at the bird feeding store. So whether it's bird feeding or you're trying to check your local, just keeping records on who's at your feeder when, and you start to learn temporal patterns, who's that, well, up here at home at least, the last bird at the feeder every night, just like clockwork, last bird to leave the feeder is a what? A female cardinal. She's there every night along with the other cardinals, and they don't leave until it's really getting pretty dark. But those kinds of observational things inform people's actions in terms of how they do things, like something as simple as feed the birds. But you could come up with dozens of similar examples. I won't belabor that right now. I did have CWD and disease down here, though, so you're off the hook in terms of causing any problems. I guess where I'd like to go now is to just offer the issue that science can't explain or handle everything. Yes, it's very beneficial, but there are some flies in the ointment. One, for example, is natural events. Floods, storms, excessive heat, events like Hurricane Ian. These kinds of things are somewhat unpredictable in terms of where they occur and what damage they do. But I think most people are willing to agree that the extremes we're seeing now are related to climate change and will likely get worse. Science can't necessarily explain in advance what the impacts of those kinds of things are going to be on an environment. The science also can't account for species adaptability or flexibility. Consider the reintroduction of turkeys in 1976. They started dumping turkeys out in southwestern Wisconsin, where they had looked at the habitat down there and what they knew about turkeys from the literature and said, oh, the turkeys are really going to be happy out here along the Wisconsin River. But they'll probably stay here. They're everywhere. I see more turkeys now driving around the cabin in Price County, pecking along the roadside, than I do outside Madison anymore. So turkeys expanded, both on their own and with some help from the DNR, into areas where no one really thought the turkeys would thrive. like the North Woods, but they've proved us wrong. There's also the matter of Leopold's original definition of wildlife management was the art of making the land produce a sustained yield of game species for human use. That definition has been tweaked a lot over the years, except for one word, and that's art. The game species has gone and been replaced by wildlife in general. For human use has been replaced by for their intrinsic value and so on. So it's been tweaked a bit, but the fact remains that Leopold is still right even after all these years. We can have all the science in the world, but someone managing a piece of land realizes that there's a bit of art and craft involved in applying the scientific principles to get the best bang for the buck, so to speak, on a piece of property. Because you just can't predict 100% what the response of these animals is going to be. You may think, well, I know they like to eat this, I'll plant that here. And they eat something else. Or you build a really fancy bluebird box and put it up, and the bluebird decides to nest in a coffee can that somebody nailed to a fence post nearby. But I think the unpredictability of these animals is one of the things that appeals to people. And of course, the other thing science can't accommodate is political impacts. And that, surprisingly enough, was actually mentioned in this review of the North American model, where they, under a section called Current Status, Threats and Challenges, although the United States and Canada have led the way in advancing the wildlife profession, wildlife management itself appears to be increasingly politicized. A rapid turnover rate of state agency directors, the makeup of boards and commissions, the organizational structure of some agencies, and examples of politics meddling in science have challenged the science foundation. That kind of thing continues today, and I'll offer up a couple of examples. In addition to the political influence, again, there seems to be a general, in some segments, a general distrust of science. That some people adhere to the old expression, figures lie and liars figure. Have you ever heard that before? By way of people being able to manipulate a set of data to say whatever they want. And in some cases, while that may be possible, it's unethical and not something a scientist would normally subscribe to. But that causes a little problem. Where the distrust comes from, I don't know, but it's manifested in people's attitudes toward climate change, among other things. There's also the issue, I think, although probably most people don't think about it very much, when I mentioned the experimentation and someone's doing an experiment to attempt to prove a point, there's a statistical probability attached to proving the point. And the acceptable level in science is usually 95% confidence in the result. 99 is a little better, but 95 is acceptable. So the point being that in one case out of 20, the experiment may not have proven what you were trying to do, but 19 out of 20 is considered acceptable. Think of it as if you were watching the news when Hurricane Ian was headed for the coast, it wasn't a line that said, wham, it's going to hit right here on Fort Myers. It was a cone. And the probability was that it was going to come ashore somewhere within that cone. They don't have the capability of predicting that exactly. Hurricane moves for a variety of reasons. So that cone of uncertainty is the same as some of the statistical uncertainty associated with some of these scientific experiments. Now, if that bothers some people, well, I don't know what to say about that, because science has advanced us in many and all conceivable ways under the constraints of those statistical probabilities. It's kind of like with CWD, the advice is still that the World Health Organization says don't eat an animal known to be infected with CWD. But has there ever been a case of CWD transmission to a human? No. However, they fall back on the fact that the Brits told their population that they couldn't get mad cow disease either, which is a similar disease, same family of diseases, and yet people did die of that infection. So there's always a slight gap between certainty and high probability. And that's why I think they err on the side of the conservative and say, don't eat sick deer. I don't have to worry about that. As soon as I drag a deer in the house, my wife's after the test results, and if it's positive, I know right where that deer is going. I got another problem actually with my wife that I should ask you about. Yesterday, this may seem a little odd, but I'm hoping somebody's got a recipe for me. I do a lot of cooking, do a lot of game cooking, but cooking in general. I specialize in pies. And yesterday I rendered the fat from a black bear that I harvested a few weeks ago because I was reading that bear lard is supposed to be the absolute finest high quality lard available for baking. I mean, in much higher quality than any commercial lard you can get. I thought, man, that seems a little weird. But I started rendering and bottling the stuff, and it quickly turned into this white open. It's just like silk. There's no smell whatsoever. That was the first thing the family pushback generated. You try and serve us a pie that smells like a dead bear, and you're out of here. I'm not too worried about that, but what I do need is to find somebody from up here in the Northwoods who's used bear lard in baking and give me some pointers. But I'm not seeing a lot of recognition here. All right, never mind. I'll go to the internet. They know everything. Anyway, how did I get onto that? Back to the political front for a moment. In my opinion, the milestones of political interference in wildlife management in this state centers on 3 or 4 things. Number one, the Natural Resources Board appointments. That's a highly political process now, as you well know. I mean, we've even got somebody on the board now whose term has expired, but it's a political football trying to figure out what's going on there. And furthermore, the fact that the DNR secretary was at one point appointed by the board, but now by the governor, and various governors have promised to do something about that situation, but haven't, that's an additional problem. However, because the board is so politicized, I'm not sure the appointment makes much difference one way or the other. But nevertheless, that's been a long-going problem. The Kroll report, that was another dandy. For those of you who don't remember it, James Kroll, otherwise known as Dr. Deere, from Stephen F. Austin University in Texas, was hired by the state to come here to Wisconsin and do a little bit of communication and stomping around the state and tell us what was wrong with deer management in Wisconsin. And I'm thinking, well, what is wrong with deer management in Wisconsin? The deer management program in Wisconsin was often held up as the standard of skilled and professional and quality management in the country. And with people like Ron Eckstein and a lot of other managers that I knew personally over the years, I was perfectly comfortable with having it in their hands. But Kroll came and he brought a crew with him, and they came up with, I think it was 68 recommendations that they thought would improve the situation. And instead of looking at them, one by one, say, this isn't a bad idea, or this is a bad idea, the word from on high was implement all 68 recommendations. Boom, just like that. Now, to the credit of the system, there were some things in there, like the DMAP program, the Deer Management Assistance Program, which is now very active in helping private landowners with deer management on their properties, that has caught on and is really doing a nice job. So there were some good things in there, but there were other things that I think we're forced to live with now that were better in the old days. I still miss on-site registration and the data it provided. I still miss the boundaries that made some sense, like a river or a road, as opposed to which county am I in? I can't see that big red stripe on the landscape. So there were some things that didn't make a great deal of sense, but we're dealing with it, and I think eventually there may be some changes. Does anybody know what a CDAC is, or has anybody served on their local CDAC, Citizens Deer Advisory Committee? These were also established because of the report. Each county has a CDAC. I'm on the Dane County Committee, and it's a citizens group that meets, excuse me, yeah. It's a citizens group that meets several times a year to set the harvest quotas, population objectives, and things like that for their county. In a way, it's a good thing to get some citizen input, but there were ways to get citizen input under the old system as well. All right, enough about that. And we've been going, I want to get to your opportunity to ask some questions and see if we can get some discussion going. Despite all of that, and saying that there are scientific doubters, there are people who don't trust science, there are problems with political situations, and so forth, I would have to summarize by saying the good news is wildlife populations in Wisconsin, for most species, are doing very well. Sure, there are some species that are at the edge of their range, prairie chickens, sharp-tailed grouse, and such, that are not thriving but never will. And it's not the fault of management, it's that they're on the edge of their biological range. There are other species that face other threats, endangered species. The bats are having problems with white nose syndrome and things like that. But on balance, our wildlife populations are in pretty darn good shape. I also think that a conclusion that you can't avoid is that science is and will remain important in management, that citizen science is playing an increasingly important role, and this is what I alluded to earlier. You folks can get involved. There's a citizen science website or page on the DNR website. You can go on there, see the whole litany of projects that you could volunteer to participate in. The Wisconsin Frog and Toad Survey. There's a turtle project. There's Project Salamander. There's all sorts of things that if you're interested, you can contribute to the understanding and data set that the DNR agencies have to work with on these species. So check that out if it's of any interest to you. And then, of course, lastly, my conclusion is, and maybe this will stimulate some discussion, some of the cases where science and technology are creating some management problems because it's hard to catch up with what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. Use of cell phones, for example. I mean, there's certainly useful things. I use an app all the time called OnX, O-N-X, that has data layers, so you know exactly where you are in the landscape. Has landowner overlays, so you know I've got to stop here. I'd be trespassing if I don't. There are habitat overlays, all sorts of useful information that when you're in the field, you can use that app. But there's some concern that the phones are being used to manipulate tags, call people artificially. You're supposed to be in voice contact with fellow hunters rather than call and say, hey, there's 6 deer headed your way. You better get ready. That's considered a violation of fair chase. And the aforementioned fish finders that do everything but drop the hook down and snag the fish, that's something else that eventually people will have to come to grips with what they want to tolerate and what they think is crossing the line. The drones, drones are great. I mean, a lot of the footage we're seeing of the hurricane damage in Florida is from drones. It's amazing. But is it fair to go out to the farm or the parcel you're hunting on and say, well, I could go climb up on this ridge and see if there's a deer up there, or I can launch my drone and watch the screen and see what I find. There are uses like that that are probably won't be allowed. There are other new technologies that are hard to manage. Have you seen or heard of an air bow? It looks like a gun, but it shoots short arrows like a crossbow with compressed air. And these only came out a couple of years ago, but they're deadly. And the question is it a bow? Is it a gun? What is it? When should it be allowed? Should we not allow these at all? Or should they be only in certain seasons? Those kinds of things are a constant struggle. Even there are still people who complain about robo-ducks. You've seen a robo-duck? Mechanical duck decoy that flaps its wings? Or doves that do the same thing? Is that kind of thing crossing the line? I don't know, but eventually people have to come to grips with what they think. Well, all right, we're nearly an hour in here. I'd like to give you a shot at the floor. And I just finished up the radio program a few hours ago. We had some very interesting questions today, none of which dealt with science. But if there's something on your mind, either related to some of the things I said about how science underlies management, and you wonder how it actually does, or just any random question about wildlife that's been nagging you, I'm happy to deal with it for a few minutes here. So the floor is open for your contribution.
Carol's going to do a demonstration of how best to use
Right up to your mouth so it doesn't squeak or squeal.
Anybody got a question? Way to step up, sir. I appreciate it.
That's harder to do.
Yeah.
So we're at a phase right now where we're kind of living with COVID. But let's get back to CWD. CWD came into this state probably on a semi. And it started out as a bullseye in Iowa County, and it slowly spread out. But where you see CWD developing now, it's across the state, and it's related to deer that are being transported on semis or trucks or trailers to new locations and infecting somebody's game farm. Politically, it's a tough question to get rid of that, but scientifically, don't you think eventually we're going to have to?
Probably. The question is, there's still a great debate over how CWD actually got here and when it got here. I think the consensus now is it was here quite a while before we actually discovered it. You don't find anything that you don't look for. And they only started to look for sick deer at that check station in Mount Horeb because there'd been a conference in Wisconsin a year before identifying some of these diseases that were a threat to the deer herd. So they said, hey, we better take a look. And lo and behold, it was some of our students from the university who were there doing the sampling as volunteers, and they found it. It was horrible news, but it still remains to be determined whether it got here on a carcass, because many carcasses are brought from the western states by Wisconsin hunters and may be disposed of in the field once the meat's removed and so forth. But you're correct that the deer industry was moving deer here, there, and everywhere for shooting preserves and for breeding purposes. And now that they've started to look at some of our deer farms, they've found infection rates of 80 or 90% of the deer on farm X, Y, or Z are actually infected. And then they try and depopulate the farm. That's a sore spot in and of itself because we pay reparations for those dead deer. So if someone has a farm that DATCAP decides needs to be depopulated, they're handed a sizable check of taxpayers' dollars to compensate them for the removal of those deer. Now, the deer farm industry in Wisconsin has dropped dramatically. I think when CWD was discovered, there were something like 950 deer farms in the state. It's way less than that now. And some areas, I think a couple of the Canadian provinces and possibly Montana are just getting to the point where they say, no more deer farms, period. They're too much trouble, get rid of them. But that's a political issue, and in Wisconsin, it's a strong political lobby. I don't know if that'll ever happen. But you're correct that eventually one of the control strategies, probably in the package of control strategies, is to prevent the movement of deer around the countryside. But that's not easy. I was told when we were working with this, Texas is the hotbed for this, and I was told that they were taking Winnebago, very expensive camper trailers, gutting them, and then using those just run the deer into the Winnebago, not a livestock trailer or like a horse trailer, run them into the Winnebago, seal them up, and driving them all over the country. Nobody was any the wiser. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but I guess it wouldn't surprise me because some of those the big money for some of the larger deer, and money talks, unfortunately.
We have a couple questions from our online audience also. One of them is, there are far more swans in Wisconsin these days. Are they having an effect on other waterfowl or ecosystems?
The number of swans. I wonder if they're referring to the growth in our resident trumpeter swan population, although there's still not a whole lot of those, or just the fact that there are a lot of tundra, or I knew there was whistling swans coming through on migration. But swans do, in some cases, interact negatively with other waterfowl. They'll chase them away, but I still don't think there's enough of them, or that they're here long enough to really have a significant impact. They might on somebody's lawn or garden pond, and people buy swan decoys to put out as a deterrent for, say, geese that are grazing on their lawn or some such thing. I'm not sure that's a big deal.
Scott, I related to CWD. Has anybody looked at, knowing the origin 22 years ago in Iowa County, and it seems like the common denominator of the spread of CWD is corn itself? That I'm not sure anybody's looked at. And my thinking is Iowa County, and I grew up in Southwest Wisconsin, and I was down there at the beginning, and I'm wondering, for a fact today, when the DNR did a release on how to prevent CWD to our deer hunters, they did not mention deer feeding. And I think we're in the mood, I don't know, in Vilas County, and please explain it to me. If we find CWD in the county or an adjacent county, we restrict the feeding of deer.
Correct.
Corn.
Correct.
Okay. And that's just an example of common denominator. And I'm thinking a prion, okay, is an enzyme disease of the nervous system. And how many mutations do we have in prions from enzymes, and especially when we're starting to deal with GMO corn? Could there be some relationship?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I suppose my answer is going to be anything is possible, but that's the kind of thing that I would recommend that you share with the DNR research team and see what they've done and what they haven't done in that regard. The baiting and feeding issue is a little more straightforward. If a positive deer is identified in a given county, then a baiting and feeding ban goes into effect for 3 years. If a positive deer is discovered within 10 miles of a county boundary in an adjacent county, then the surrounding or abutting counties are also under a feeding ban. However, that's not the easiest thing in the world to enforce.
Exactly.
People are going to feed their deer if they've been doing it for years and they want to see the deer outside the kitchen window or whatever. A lot of them are going to continue to do it. I've had, it wouldn't be the first debate I've had with somebody in a lane at Savemore who's got 6 bags of corn in a cart. And I say, hey, what the heck are you doing with that? I'm feeding the squirrels. Mind your own business. I said, well, so that's a difficult thing to deal with, but they do feel it will help since transmission by bodily fluid exchange is an issue. But the ideas about it being somehow involved with the crop itself genetically, that's something you should talk to the researchers about, either within the DNR or within the university agronomy community. We had a soil scientist who was working with the holdover of prions in the soil for many years, and they worked on that, and I would assume there might be somebody in agronomy interested in the crop issue too. I'm not sure who that would be anymore, but worth a try.
My main question, that was just a follow-up of the vein that we were taking. Leopold, which we're both think him as a hero and a guy way ahead of his time, and I still do, always said the only thing that's going to save our resources is our ability to limit the gadgets that we use in pursuit. Okay, so we can talk about all the science we want. Okay, but again, look at the economics and money and the gadgets that we've created that are putting more pressure on the resource. So I guess that's one vein I want your comment on. But the other vein is Leopold also believed in science can go only so far, in the fact that the more time we spend trying to figure out something experimentally or whatever, the problem is only going to get worse. So he was a big believer in also in taking empirical observation and trying something new if it didn't work to solve the problem. So can you comment on both those?
Well, he was also a big believer in the human element, that it was important to study people's attitudes and behaviors as well and factor that into the equation. You can come up with whatever science you wish to suggest that a gadget is unfair advantage or what have you, but if the people have been using something for years and like it, enjoy it or whatever, trying to pry that out of their hands is not an easy proposition. So that's why some of these more contemporary things like drones and the fish finders and so forth, they're trying to get out ahead of that as quickly as they can before it becomes ingrained. I suspect a Cabela's or Bass Pro catalog in Leopold's day would have been about 4 pages thick. Now it's 400 pages thick and growing, and it's just filled with everything you can imagine to make things simpler, easier, more efficient, or what have you. And people who adopt those things are reluctant, very reluctant. I mean, who's going to give up their cell phone these days if it was determined that, maybe all of a sudden there's, hey, these things are really ruining our kids. They're not doing this or that anymore. I don't know if it would make any difference.
So where does the land ethic come in? Okay, is that the substitute for?
Can you repeat that for the online listeners?
Where does the land ethic come in? Leopold felt that people, particularly those who owned a piece of land, had an ethical responsibility to take care of it. And I think his quote that I like best was the most difficult thing in today's society is to own a piece of land without destroying it. And that for me kind of summarizes the land ethic, but that tends to apply primarily to people who have some control over the landscape, where our vast urban audiences who are living in condos and apartments can't even relate to that. I can only tell you from that regard that in the landowner workshops that we still conduct at Kemp every year, called the Coverts Project, where we bring private landowners in and talk to them about land management principles and care of the land. Those people, we've over the years now, I think, reached close to 800, and I don't know how many tens of thousands of acres. For the most part, those people really want to do what's right by their land, and they want to see it protected and perpetuated. And they're willing to sacrifice other things to see that happen. So that's the good news. There aren't that many land abusers out there anymore, at least in my opinion, as far as woodland owners are concerned. Now, somebody who owns a 100-acre tract on the edge of Madison and is just waiting to cash in to sell it off for a strip mall or a new Walmart parking lot or something, that's a different matter.
We have another online question. And then another up here. Why does bear hunting allow baiting and using dogs in a seemingly inhumane way?
That's another good one. There are 3 main tactics for pursuing bears. One is hunting them over bait. One is pursuing them with hounds, and the other one is what's called fair chase bear hunting, where no hounds, no bait. You just go into the woods and look for a bear. That's imminently unsuccessful, the latter one. For those of you who wander around here in the North Woods, how often do you see a bear? Not very often. And if you were out intentionally with the idea of harvesting that bear, it would be a very low return proposition. So the baiting or the dog use cropped up over the years as being the most efficient ways to harvest bears. And we currently have a lot of bears in Wisconsin. And there are enough problems involved with bear populations that it's a good thing that some are being harvested. The part of the question that troubles me a little bit is the part about the perception that it's inhumane. The baiting issue, is more a matter of personal choice. For someone who wants to hunt a bear, you have to make a decision whether you want to sit over a bait pile and wait for the bear to come in for a bite to eat and shoot it. Is that fair? Is it ethical? That's a decision. But the fact is it inhumane? No, I don't think that really applies. The dog pursuit might be perceived as being inhumane, and I was a little worried about that. I drew a tag this year in Zone B, east of here, that I'd waited 12 years for. And I thought, well, I've not been bear hunting. I've been wondering if I really want to do this, but under the theory of don't knock it until you've tried it, I said, I'm going to go. I have a good friend over there who has dogs. They're nice dogs. They're part of his family. I said, well, let's give it a go. My son flew out from Denver and we went bear hunting. And I was actually surprised by the enthusiasm of the group. It's really a team effort. There were 10 or 12 people involved the morning we went out. I was the only person with a tag and a gun. But everybody was really excited about the whole thing. It was like going to the ball game. And there was a great deal of enthusiasm. We finally found a bear. The dogs were released and the chase was on. And at that point, it actually got pretty exciting, listening to the dogs, trying to figure out where they were and what was going on. I thought it was a fish in a barrel kind of thing. But as it turns out, only maybe one time in 3 does the bear actually tree, or do the dogs catch up to it. They may just keep walking. In this case, they did tree the bear. We had a heck of a time getting into the middle of the swamp where the bear was treed. And again, I think the perception is that the bear is, well, I'm only talking from a sample size of 1 here. But at least in this case, when we get in there, the bear's up the tree, and yep, there he is. But there was no growling, no tooth popping, no sign of distress whatsoever. In fact, at one point while we were watching, trying to decide what to do with this particular bear, it kind of curled up in the crotch of the tree and took a nap. It was completely disinterested in the dogs that were going berserk at the base of the tree. But because it's legal to train dogs on bears for a big chunk of the summer, chances are these bears, some of the bears may have been treed or pursued half a dozen times, and we're kind of used to it. Well, in any event, I realized quickly once I got in there, and I was the person with the tag, and 12 people had invested half a day in trying to get this bear up a tree, that my options were fairly limited. Once they determined that it was a satisfactory bear of the size I was looking for, they said, well, you shoot the bear. I had been thinking about that all morning, but ultimately I did, because I had to do that in order to complete the hunt. If I'd walked away, I'm sure they'd have been disappointed, And ultimately, I would not have known what it was truly like. The quote that I use in our hunting classes we teach around the country is you don't hunt to kill, you kill in order to have hunted. You got to think about that one a little bit, but it's the opportunity that's important, but the only way you culminate the whole thing is to actually kill, and that makes the hunt. And back to the point of the question,
Yes, I wondered if,
my whole morning with that operation, I saw nothing that I viewed as inhumane. The bear was largely unaware of what was going on. It showed no sign of distress. The dogs were doing their thing and seemed quite happy about it. All the people involved were happy with the performance of the dog. After we shot the bear, there were lots of pictures, a lot of backslapping, and then the crew all pitched in. I said, we're a mile from the trucks in the middle of this swamp. I said, don't worry, we'll get the bear out. And they did. I thought I was going to die, but I finally got out as well. And then we had the bear, took it to a local establishment in the area where they had a scale to weigh it. Everybody piled out of the bar to see the bear and take pictures and whatnot. It was a real event. And I was, in retrospect, I was happy to participate in it as a central character. And I'm glad I did it, but I probably won't do it again.
I wondered if whoever asked the question was commenting on dogs that get taken out by bears.
That dogs that are
In
injured
terms
by
of
bears? Oh,
the
well,
inhumanity,
that's another matter. But at least the houndsmen I was with, they are very careful with the dogs. And they know when to call them off and so on. That's not to say that the dog doesn't get swatted occasionally, and they do get injured, but that's a major loss to the houndsmen. They invest a lot of time and effort in training those dogs. So it's something they try and avoid. The dogs seem to be having the time of their lives. I mean, they live for that. Much like my Labrador lives for chasing pheasants. And if they don't get to do it, I think there's something missing from their lives. So.
Totally different subject. We're seeing an influx of wake boats up by us in the northern part of the county. And we already are concerned about how the wake boats affect the lake beds. Is there a study that looks at how those wake boats affect the fisheries within the lakes?
If there is, I'm not aware of it. That's a little off my turf. It's why I live on a 110-acre lake with a 10-mile-an-hour speed limit and no jet skis. I just find those inconsistent with what I enjoy about the North Woods. So if you happen to be on Minocqua or Tomahawk or whatever, where there's all manner of watercraft at all hours of the day, that's part of the territory, at least for the summer months.
we have another online question. Here comes the wolf question. I've read about wolves being a keystone predator in some of the national parks, and allowing their resurgence has been good for the ecosystem. Is there science behind that?
The question is are the reintroductions of wolves that have taken place in Idaho and Yellowstone National Park and so forth considered to be a good thing? Certainly the wolf proponents are happy about it. The wolves have done an amazing job at putting a lid on some of the ungulate populations like elk. Depending on your point of view, that's a good thing or a bad thing. But in terms of protecting the range and allowing some tree species and other things that the elk had badly overbrowsed to recover, then ecologically, it's probably a good thing. They were there originally. The elk and the wolves learned to live together long before we were on the landscape. So I think most people are happy with the result.
Any other questions for the
Another
night?
question or
Oh.
two from here, and then we're going to call it good. And I'm going to turn my truck south and go see all those orange barrels again.
I think we're good.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Scott Craven. Thanks to everyone for coming and asking questions. And thanks to our sponsors, Lakeland Badger Chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Minocqua Public Library, Trout Lake Station, and the Brittingham Foundation, and special thanks to WXPR and Aaron Gottsacker for being here tonight, and our host, the Oak Fire Pizzeria and Bar. Our next event, again, will be November 2nd, and our speaker will be Nathaniel Chin, talking about Alzheimer's disease. And don't forget to sign up for our emails. You'll get a reminder of every month when we're about to have another presentation. And you can also leave us ideas of speakers that you might want to see. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in November.